and we can get started. All right, it is Monday morning, and we are all about happiness today, huh? All right, here we go. Share screen. So let's see. Can everyone see? We good? All right, fantastic. So my name is Christine Whelan, and thank you, Sarah, for that wonderful introduction. I am known as the happy professor at UW-Madison. And the reason for that is because I teach a class called Consuming Happiness, about how we try to buy happiness using our limited resources of time, of energy, and of money, and what works and what doesn't as we try to use our limited resources to maximize our well-being. And so what I really look at is some of the successful and unsuccessful practices around happiness and well-being. There are a lot of them, as you know, and our culture today is absolutely seeped in advice around happiness, products that you can or should buy if you want to engage in wellness, well-being, self-care. All of these are buzzwords that you probably have heard, if not seen almost daily on your social media feed. So as the happy professor, and in this class, I have undergraduates flooding into my classroom to kind of learn more about this. And what I do from the outset in this class is we define happiness, or we attempt to define happiness. Because one of the things that I often break to my students on maybe, if not the first lecture, definitely by the second lecture, is I tell them, unfortunately, there probably has been a mistake. That this is not going to necessarily be about happiness in the way that they think. And I also confess to them that happiness is one of my least favorite words. As the happy professor, that happiness is one of my least favorite words, in part because it is a really difficult word to define. And we use it kind of willy-nilly to define a whole slew of different ideas, to conflate a whole slew of different cultural values, of different assumptions around norms about the way things used to be, the way things are, the way things should be. So all of those elements make happiness a fairly tricky word. So what I'd like to do in today's session is kind of set the stage for what I hope is going to be a really rich and deep dive today into happiness, not in the way that my students think of it on the first day they show up, but hopefully in the way that we all as educators and as my students think of it when they leave my class, which is as a topic that is complex, that is set in a historical time period, that is laden with values and assumptions about cultural norms, but that is also a really rich thing to explore as we try to figure out what the good life is, what it means to us, and how we as individuals and as an interconnected society can have a sort of choose your own adventure as we think about what our limited time, our limited resources, our limited energy here on this earth, where we should focus it to have the maximum well-being, not just for us, but for the world and hopefully the planet going forward. So my talk is going to be a fairly big overview. And I'm trying to keep it at a high level so that we can, so I can provide hopefully some ideas that maybe you can come back to throughout the day. But what I want to talk about is the different sort of definitions and types of happiness and what someone might mean when they say, I just want to be happy. I want to talk a little bit about religious definitions of happiness, because so much of our ideas of the right and wrong of happiness and the good life come from religious traditions, whether we like it or not. And the idea of how to live our lives here on earth and how to live our lives in the afterlife, if there is one, is something that is very much tied up with our ideas of good life. In the last 30 years or so, maybe a little more, we've had a boom in the science of happiness. And this is the realm of positive psychology, but also the realm of, can we separate science? Can we separate what we as individuals feel about happiness from a broader look as a society and as a world about sort of universals in terms of happiness? And then finally, I want to just highlight and hopefully tee up for the rest of the speakers the idea of global comparisons around happiness, because we do a lot of that right now, and it's quite problematic. So it's worth sort of thinking about happiness. And finally, I want to end with the idea of what do we actually know? And I'm going to tell you what I actually believe we know about happiness, and leave it up to you to decide whether those are shared beliefs for yourself as well. Along the way, I know that there are many educators who are joining us today, and I want to invite you to put comments in the chat as I go. It won't distract me, and I will answer them if I can. Otherwise, we'll talk about them at the end. And also, think about, you can think about any questions you might have about how specifically you would teach one of these ideas, because these are all ideas that I have taught in my classes over the years, and ones that I have tested out with a whole variety of different interactive exercises. And since I am such a fan of interactive exercises, I thought we might begin with one. And this is so for those of you who have never used Zoom Annotate, if you sort of drag your mouse either up to the top of your screen, or I think if you have a PC, it may be on the bottom, there will be a little pencil that says Annotate. If you click on that, you are able to click on something that says text, and you're able to put some text in. And so I invite you now to share your own definitions of happiness. What I'm hoping to see here, oh, and you can also change the color of the text if for some reason it's coming up as yellow and you can't see. Ah, there we go, sunshine. I love it. So pop in your definitions of happiness. You can think of it like that Pharrell song. Clap along with me if you know what happiness means to you. I can see some beginning to pop in. Social connectedness. Absolutely. Social connectedness around happiness is a big one. Yes, there's a draw function, but then there's also a text function that might be easier unless you're really quite good with your pencil. Laughter. And you can also pop it in. You know what? That's another good point. You can also pop it into the text as well, into the meeting chat as well, if it's easier for you. And I can see it, and I will be able to see it there. A calm lack of striving. Ooh, bridges, like building bridges. I love it. Unity, serenity. Nature, contentment, time with friends and family, silence, peace. All right, I love all of these things. Contentment, wealthness, having a wealth and abundance of goodness, I would imagine. Simplicity, family, my happy place, inner peace. I love all of these. Now, as I am looking at all of these, first of all, I'm getting a sense of calm and serenity from this group. This is clearly what we all want as we are in late July, right? With all kids home and the craziness of the summer and looking ahead toward the school year, right? We are looking for serenity and silence now, aren't we? There are other definitions of happiness as well. Joy, excitement, energy, new adventures, right? For a lot of people, those are definitions of happiness as well. But even in the ones that we've just put here right now, the idea that happiness can be synonymous with sunshine, so brightness and energy and new beginnings potentially, and also synonymous with peace and silence, and then also synonymous with social connectedness. This is all true. These are all definitions of happiness. Yet if I say to you, I am happy today, how do you know which one I mean? How do you know how to measure whether my happiness is an energetic happiness or a calm happiness? Does it matter? Does it matter whether my happiness is one of support and balance, or one of opportunity and no judgment I'm seeing pop in here? All of these are excellent phrases, and I think you would all agree that they're all also a little bit different. I'm glad to see that so many of you are putting things like social connectedness and connection, because we're going to get right there. That is a really important element of happiness as well. But one of the reasons why I wanted to begin this way is so that we could all see that there are many different types of descriptions for happiness. And when I teach classes on consuming happiness, I start with the idea of what is happiness. And defining happiness is an important approach, because until we define happiness, how can we possibly know how to use our limited resources to maximize it? How can we go get something unless we know what it is that we are trying to get? Now, as many of you know, the psychological research is very compelling on the fact that it turns out humans are terrible, terrible judges of knowing what is going to make us happy. In fact, we're also terrible judges of knowing what we want. We think we know what we want, but often what we want and what we need to have to give ourselves the feeling that we are seeking are two very different things. So philosophers have spent a fair amount of time, both in ancient times and in modern times, trying to figure out how to define happiness in a way that can be, if not rigorously studied back in the day, that can be put into various different definitions. There is a wonderful philosopher called David Nettle, and he is at a British university, and he studies happiness in terms of really the politics of happiness and why definitions of happiness, going back to ancient times, matter in modern times. And what he says is that there are three levels of the definition of happiness. The first level is that happy feeling and emotion that you don't even have to really think about. You just know it. You know when you are happy. It can be expected, it can be unexpected. There's not a whole lot of need for analysis. Sometimes just joy wells up inside you, or you're just laughing. You're having a great time at a party. That's level one happiness. And that kind of happiness is fantastic. He says level two happiness, though, is the next step, which is that, yes, you can have all of this joy in the moment, but sometimes, you know what, sometimes it's not joyful in the moment. We've got a lot of emotions. If any of you have seen that movie Inside Out, which I love, and if you have not, do not just think, oh, this is a little kid's movie. As a Pixar animated movie, it is for adults and children alike. And it, to me, still years later, is one of the best ways of describing all of the balance of emotions that all of us have inside our heads. And we have the woman in yellow, who is joy. And then we have all of these other feelings. We have anger, we have sadness, we have anxiety, and we have disgust. We have all of these feelings inside us. And level two happiness is that feeling of contentment and life satisfaction when we say, you know what, we're not all joy all the time, but we've got this balance going on. And overall, in the balance sheet approach, we're doing pretty well. We have some ups and we have some downs, but generally things are going pretty well for us. That would be a level two kind of happiness. That's a little bit of a quieter sense of happiness than that momentary joy, but it also can be more lasting. Then there is level three happiness, and level three happiness is actually the kind of happiness that most of us academics who study happiness are really talking about when we say happiness. Level 3 happiness is that sense of a life well lived, a feeling of flourishing, that you are not only content, but that you are doing things, you are engaging in activities, and you are transcending yourself to bring happiness to others, to do something meaningful, and to live out your values in a way that matters to you. So when we talk about this level 3 happiness, this is what Martin Seligman, who the father of positive psychology, will talk about him. When he talks about well-being, he is talking about this kind of level 3 happiness. We're talking about a more enduring sort of a sense of a successful, good life. Now, often, though, what our tendency is to focus only on level 3 happiness. And when we don't have that, we think we've failed and we're not happy. But in each day, there hopefully is a sense of level 1 happiness at some point. We hopefully have moments of level 2 happiness, of that contentment, of that quiet and calm and peace that so many of you mentioned. And then that level 3 happiness, that sense of flourishing, well, that comes when we have a sense of the larger why behind what we are seeking. But all 3 of those levels of happiness come together as we look back now at the ancients, because just because David Nettle is a philosopher right now does not mean that he is the first one to discuss this. And so I want to take us into the Wayback Machine and do a little bit of a jaunt through Aristotle and his 2 types of happiness, because Aristotle and then so many of the religious thinkers are really at the core of our ideas and our norms about what happiness means. So Aristotle, in his famous work, Nicomachean Ethics, wrote about these 2 types of happiness. And he said that there was hedonic happiness and eudaimonic happiness. Hedonic happiness was the idea of pleasure in the moment, of a good meal, of a fun party. You could think of this sort of as that level 1 joy and excitement and fun that David Nettle talks about. But hedonic happiness in particular, if you want to sort of live a life of hedonism, is about trying to maximize pleasure and minimize pain all the time. It's about, choosing the fun rather than delaying gratification. And I often joke with my students that they may have some experience with hedonic happiness. It's that long weekend of one party after another, and then all of a sudden you wake up on Monday morning and wonder what it is you're doing with yourself. That is in part because hedonic happiness, for the most part, has to come to an end at some point. The party ends at some point. And then if we are only pursuing hedonic happiness, well, then we look in the mirror and feel kind of empty. So what Aristotle talks about is a more enduring and longer lasting happiness that he sees really as higher order happiness. And this higher order happiness is eudaimonic happiness. So eudaimonic happiness is this sense of living in keeping with your values, of living a virtuous life. And because Aristotle was in the time of gods and the idea that philosophers were thinking of what might a human do that it wouldn't be laughable to think that gods would do as well. Well, he thought the idea of contemplation was something that could be something that both humans and gods might do. And so he then saw eudaimonic happiness as contemplation, as thinking about the good life, as thinking about how to live a virtuous life, and then putting it into action. So Aristotle had these 2 different ideas. There was hedonic happiness and eudaimonic happiness. And I have to tell you, for the last, 50 years or so, a lot of the happiness literature has mostly focused on the idea of eudaimonic happiness as the higher order happiness. And yes, it is. It's the idea of doing something meaningful, of being purposeful, of having that satisfaction of the Thanksgiving table, of looking around at your loved ones who you may or may not have fought with, in the last year, and saying, you know what, I feel very blessed. I have put energy and effort into these relationships, and I feel satisfied with my life. That is a wonderful kind of happiness. We cannot also forget the importance of hedonic happiness. So I tell my students that I wish them a lifetime of eudaimonic happiness with plenty of hedonic happiness along the way as well, because we very much need a mix and a balance of both. And I think that's something that has been missing from a lot of the happiness and self-help literature until the last several years. Now we're seeing more work on the importance of play, the importance of joy and energy in adulthood, and the idea of laughter and fun. And both of these are really important as we look into happiness. Epicurus looked at what Aristotle was doing as well, but took a little bit of a different approach, because while Aristotle said that eudaimonic happiness really was the highest order thing that people could do, Epicurus argued that hedonic happiness, when done correctly, really was about enjoying the simple pleasures of life, was about savoring the moment, was not about squandering your life here on earth only in hopes of some future with the gods, but that if you enjoy your life, you are also living a virtuous life. And Epicurus got some traction. Anyone, what is the modern website that bears his name? I think my students don't know it, but I would imagine that you know it quite well. And it's the Epicurious website, because the idea of cooking, of savoring the moment, of savoring tastes, of eating well, and of experiencing that kind of pleasure was very much part of the Epicurean approach to life. So we have Aristotle, who is thinking about happiness as really more in terms of this higher order virtue and contemplative idea of what the gods might do. We have Epicurus, who is thinking about pleasure in the moment. And then a lot of this literature is put aside. We have a Dark Ages period in Europe, and we have this idea that things are things don't go well for kind of a while, and in Europe anyway. And people are beginning to very much realize, as if they hadn't before, that the world is a painful place. We realize this right now too, right? The world is a painful place. And so when you think about happiness in a world where there is suffering, in a world where there is inequality, in a world where there is injustice, people seek a reason for it, an answer, an understanding for why this might be. And it's into this that the role of religion and happiness, I think, is really worth discussing. Aquinas was one of the early Catholic Christian philosophers and scholars to bring back the ideas of Aristotle, but through a very Catholic lens. And so what Aquinas argued was that virtuous actions aren't enough, that really what you can't be happy here on earth. You need to be happy only, the perfect happiness only comes through God in heaven. So this is an explanation for why things aren't always great on earth, but if you live a good and virtuous life, then you can and you gear that good and virtuous life toward a life with God in the afterlife, then you can find happiness. So in the Christian perspective, the good life is really on earth is really a path to eternal life with God in heaven. This is important from a perspective of happiness, because then if you are suffering here on earth and you're not totally happy, that's okay. There's going to be a part two that's going to go for eternity, and your suffering, if given up for God, is going to be rewarded. So this is now an interesting way of explaining the fact that the world is a painful place. Happiness is not always something that we can have, but doing it through a religious lens where you are really looking toward the future. Now, it's not, of course, just Christianity in Europe that we should be talking about here. There were entire other approaches that were going on all over the world. And while I am not going to be able to talk about all of them, I want to highlight two more that I think are very interesting in their different approaches. Because while Christianity and Catholicism was saying that the world is a hard place and that happiness is really something for the afterlife, the Aztecs had a very different spin on happiness. The Aztecs very much believed the goal was to harmonize body, mind, social purpose, and wonder at nature. So they saw these four things going on. So you have your physical self, and you have your soul, your spiritual self. But then you have what you are called to do, your social purpose, and you have the world around you. And what they said is that there are going to be ups and downs. And true happiness maybe is more like that balance sheet level 2 approach in the Aztec world. The idea of contentment at the balance of things. You enjoy the joyful moments, you know that there's going to be suffering, but you hold those two together in the duality of joy and pain. The slips and the slides, the powerful ascents and the low lows of life. So the Aztecs very much saw life as a balance, and saw contentment and the good life as recognizing and embracing that balance. That balance was not only just about self, but also about others and about nature. This is mostly missing from some of the other Judeo-Christian approaches, where certainly it is about individuals and it is about self. It is about others and self and people. But the idea that there is an interconnection with the land and with nature is something that is kind of interesting in this Aztec spin. And then I also wanted to take us to the east a bit, but really anchor this in Wisconsin as well. This is the picture of Matthew Ricard. And I had the honor of meeting him with Professor Richie Davidson, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. And he is known as the happiest man alive, in part because Professor Davidson here at UW did all sorts of brain scan studies of him as he meditated, and lots of well-being tests on him. And I got to tell you, I'm very skeptical when people say, oh, this is the happiest man alive. This man radiated happiness. I've never encountered a being like him before. It was wild. The Buddhist approach to happiness is, and this is very much a high level view of it, and somebody can go into much more detail about it, but is about a state of being. And so happiness then is about contentment, being free from worry, inner peace. In fact, many of you, when you were defining happiness, were defining it much more in a kind of Buddhist approach to happiness than a Christian one. But the idea of interconnection is also really important here. So what you can see here is that all major world religions, and there are many, many more obviously that I did not discuss, all of these major world religions talk about happiness in some way, because really religion is about the good life here on earth. And if you can't have the good life here on earth, will you be rewarded in an afterlife? And if you won't be, will you be reincarnated? What happens in terms of life after death? And what is the purpose and the meaning of your life here on earth? These are all very heady topics. And it is into this that the modern science of happiness comes. Now, we often think about science and religion as being diametrically opposed. But when you're talking about something like happiness and you are trying to measure it in a scientific way, even in a social scientific way, you end up sort of seeing much more of an intersection of these religious ideas and these ideas of science and sort of nomothetic versus ideographic ways of knowing. So I would imagine most of you are familiar with the concepts of positive psychology. Positive psychology is the godfather of positive psychology is Martin Seligman, and he very much believed that psychology was mostly focused on what is wrong with us rather than what is right with us. And what he wanted to look at is what made people have well-being, what were the keys to flourishing, what were the ideas of well-being and a life that was good. He came up with the acronym PERMA. And he said that the good life really can be achieved through this idea of positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, and achievement. Now, to come up with this idea of PERMA, he did all sorts of well-being scales. He talked to tons and tons of people. He did longitudinal studies. He did widespread studies, not just here in the US, but worldwide, all around the idea of kind of trying to come up with a nomothetic, a sort of for the group approach to what happiness means. He's written many books on this, and they're really, really excellent. But what's interesting about this is that there's still cultural and religious ideas very much built in to what your definition of, for example, let's try meaning. What is meaningful to you? If you come at this from a particularly religious perspective, then meaning has to be intertwined with your faith. If you come at things from a sort of here and now success perspective, achievement very much is going to be something that you define in a different way than if you are looking toward the afterlife. So our religious ideas of happiness, our cultural ideas of happiness, all this comes in to how we might answer some of Seligman and other researchers' approach. One of my favorite authors currently around happiness and well-being is Arthur Brooks. He writes a column called How to Build a Life for The Atlantic. He's a professor at Harvard. And he, one of his wonderful things that he talks about is a formula for happiness. And his formula for happiness is that you need to look at what you have in life and you divide what you have by what you want. I love this formula because it's very simple. And what he is suggesting here is when we talk about happiness, we can talk about it in whatever religious or cultural way that we want to talk about it, but we also have to take a step back and think about the wanting mind, thinking about how much we want versus how much we have. And what we have seen over the last couple decades is that we have a lot more than we did before. But the challenge is we're not any happier because we also want more. And so if you continue to want more, no matter how much you have, you will never be satisfied. And Arthur Brooks's formula for happiness is to make sure that what you have is greater than what you want. And as he says, there are two ways you can do this. You can increase what you have. That's dangerous, though, because what you want may also increase. The better way, he says, is to decrease what you want, and is to think more in terms of gratitude and simplicity, and not always be angling for the next thing. Now, this is kind of interesting because this pulls in all sorts of various different religious and cultural perspectives as well. And I think you're going to hear when we talk about some of the Nordic approaches to happiness a little bit more about this, because the idea of contentment with what you have and satisfaction with what you have and having enough is something that is not particularly an American approach to happiness often, but one that has been successful around the world. Another element to mention in positive psychology that I think is really, I'm just going to throw this out there because my hope is that you can discuss this more, is Sonia Lyubomirsky's happiness pie. I have really mixed feelings about this happiness pie, but it's been out there for about more than 20 years now. And according to Lyubomirsky's research, she argues that about 50% of our happiness is genetic and is sort of, there is a set point that no matter what happens for us, we are going to be Eeyores or Winnie the Poohs, and we will be either sort of happy or sort of generally depressed or whatever. We'll just be who we are. And 50% of it is genetic. She says about 10% of it is circumstances. So that would be whether you were born to a rich family or a poor one, where you live, whether you are sick or healthy, how old you are. And then she says about 40% of your happiness is up to you, is in your control. Now, this happiness pie is incredibly popular in the self-help industry because it suggests that a big chunk of your ability to be happy and thrive in life is up to you. That's wonderful. And I maybe hope that that is true. I'm a little bit skeptical. The idea that only 10% of our happiness is dependent on income, social status, social injustice, that has always been a little bit tricky for me because I feel like it may minimize the role of social change and equality and movements toward equality in terms of making a culture happier, and then put more onus on the individual and intentional activity and saying, well, listen, your happiness is all up to you. So this is something that I hope that we can discuss further, maybe in questions, but also something that you might think about through the rest of the day, which is how much of our happiness is in our individual control. And in particular, what are the social costs of saying that happiness is mostly in an individual's control? Might we be blaming the victim when people are unhappy, and in fact not looking at some of the larger social changes that we can make that might raise the happiness levels for more of us? To put a lot of this research into perspective, I'm wondering whether you guys will just play along with me for a little, for just a brief little experiment. To do this, though, I'm going to stop screen sharing for just a second because this is mostly funny if we all participate. All right, here we go. You ready? If you are willing, would you turn your cameras on? Take a pen or a pencil and put it between your teeth, like so. Yes? Oh, yes, you look lovely. Now, as you do this, it is important to put it between your teeth, okay? Right? Not between your lips, because if you put it between your lips, you frown, right? But if you put it between your teeth, it is forcing a smile. Yes? Now, this forced smile is called a Duchenne smile. Yeah? All right. This is very silly. I mostly just do this because it makes everybody happy to look at everybody else, you know, with the pen and the pencil between their teeth, right? All right. Well, so here's the thing about this. There have been lots of experiments done on the Duchenne smile. Hold on, I'm going to share my screen again. So there are lots of experiments that have been done on the Duchenne smile, and many experiments around this have suggested that if you put a pencil or pen between your teeth and then you like read a cartoon or something like that, you will find the cartoon funnier because you are forcing a smile. I have loved this research forever. I have absolutely loved this research. I have thought it was so hilarious. And so I was rather disappointed in the last year or so to see the large studies and the meta-analysis of this to show that, in fact, this research does not hold up when you look at it more closely. This to me was terribly disappointing because I would have everybody in my classes, putting the pencil between their teeth. And I just thought that this was the funniest thing and most fun thing ever. And I just wanted this study to be true. The fact that it's been called into question, and that many of these studies have been called into question, I think is really worth noting in happiness research in general. We want to believe that there is a quick fix to happiness. We want to believe that there is something small that we can do that is going to make us happy in some easy way. And we also want to believe that it is only up to the individual to make themselves happy. And I think that's something that really can be explored more throughout the course of the day, because I think it's a very important point in happiness literature right now. One study that really has not been debunked, and in fact, one study that is only gaining in its significance and its import, is this Harvard happiness study that talks about the importance of one really key thing in terms of living a happy life. And it's not earth-shattering. We all know it, but it's also not as easy as putting a pencil between our teeth or saying that we're going to just try to smile more. It turns out that the quality of your relationships and your investment in your relationships is really the single biggest predictor of what makes you happy in life. This is something that is really pretty important for us to understand, because it speaks to our interconnectedness when it comes to happiness and well-being. And if you have not read Robert Waldinger's book on the good life, I highly recommend it. It came out a couple years ago. It's very readable, and it is also very readable for students. So I think it also has some nice chapters that could be easily assigned. He also has a TED Talk that is wonderful. And so if you would just prefer an 18-minute TED Talk to assign to your students, a lot of the highlights are there. So interconnectedness, relationships, our thinking about ourselves not only as individuals who are solely responsible for our happiness, but as part of a larger whole. In the School of Human Ecology, we talk about this as the difference between ego you, ego, thinking about me all the time and what can I do to make myself happier, and eco you, which is ECO, the idea of an ecological perspective, a larger interconnected, intertwined perspective of happiness. And this Harvard happiness study very much underscores just this point. It is the quality of our relationships and the interconnectedness that makes a really big difference. Which then leads us to my final, very brief point, because it's going to be talked about lots more today, around global happiness comparisons. And I want to just put up the 2023 World Happiness Rankings. And I want to suggest that these World Happiness Rankings are somewhat more complex than what we hear about in the media reports. So one of the things that we hear is that Finland and the Nordic countries are definitely the happiest countries on earth. And while there are lots of reasons for that, I think that often when Americans hear that, we may miss the point a smidge. When we think about happiness, first of all, these World Happiness Rankings are asking similar questions in different languages of a worldwide population. Some countries have an individual approach to happiness. The United States certainly does. When we ask somebody, are you happy? An American is going to think, am I, me, happy right now? And I'm going to judge that whether I feel fulfilled, whether I feel joyful. Somebody in a more collectivist sort of approach of a nation, in some Asian countries, for example, might think of happiness as, am I fulfilling my social roles? Am I doing what I need to be doing for my family? Is my community happy? The same question is asked and answered But our individual approach to how we ask and answer that question is going to determine what we put down on that survey. There was an interesting article in the New York Times that I'm hoping our next speaker might be able to speak to a little bit more as well, around a Nordic and in particular a Finnish approach to happiness that is talking about having enough. So rather than having more and more and better, which is usually our sort of American approach to happiness, it is the idea of, am I content? Do I have enough? Is it good enough? And if you have an is it good enough approach to happiness, you are much more likely to say, yes, I am very happy, than if you feel that you need to have a super yacht to be happy. So our sort of individual and collective differences, our contentment or pleasure differences, all of these come into how we ask and answer these questions of happiness and well-being. Now, I've only put up the first because I was really going to be comparing the Nordic countries to the United States, but hopefully as you go through the talks today, you can see some of the other rankings, and this is all available online. These countries will rate things differently. So, for example, if we look at percentages of corruption, then that will change country by country. Sorry, perceptions of corruption is what I meant to say, but it'll change country by country. Generosity and healthy life expectancy, all those things will change. You can see that GDP per capita is a really important element of this particular ranking. And that, my friends, is a topic that I spend weeks and weeks in Consuming Happiness discussing, because this is the idea of what is the appropriate measure of the wealth of a nation. Are you measuring the wealth of a nation only by its output, or are you measuring the wealth of a nation by its connections, relationships, and joy? So what do we know? Well, we know that life is hard. And we know that people have been looking at happiness for a long time because life is hard, and we want to have some explanations for it, and we want to hopefully do better. We also know that humans, we have evolved to be social creatures, and that means that relationships matter and our happiness is interconnected. And when I say interconnected, I do mean in our relationships people we see, but also in terms of our worldwide relationships, because a lot of this interconnection and this global happiness that we are going to be talking about for the rest of the day, just because it's on the other side of the world, does that matter to us and our happiness and well-being here in the United States? Increasingly it does. And thinking about do we need to be happy for me to be fully happy is a question worth considering. So relationships very much matter. And of course, there is a whole lot more to learn when it comes to our assumptions about happiness, when it comes to our definitions of the good life. And my hope is really that now when you think about happiness, you can think about it through a more complex lens, through definitions that are a little bit murkier, and also understand that your definitions of happiness are happiness circa 2023, but they're informed by Judeo-Christian tradition, by historical traditions, by cultural norms of what success looks like. And those self-help books that are out there, they are not frivolous. They, in fact, are windows into what our current culture thinks about when it comes to happiness and well-being. So the next time you see something about happiness on social media, on your feed, on something about self-care and well-being, you can roll your eyes, yes, but look at it, take a step back as an educator and look at it and say, what does this say about our cultural moment when it comes to happiness? And is this one that I actually want to buy into? Because one of my early mentors said, when self-help doesn't work, try social change. And that is an idea that I very much embrace, and I hope that you as educators will think about as well as you educate your students on happiness.